We're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled, "He accidentally saw the alien giantess while she was changing. What she does next will shock you." Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now, we begin. The storm that ate the horizon had no voice, only teeth. Ion dust raked the planet in glittering sheets that flashed blue when lightning crawled across the belly of the sky. The human outpost crouched in the wasteland like a fistful of bones. 4 pressure domes, a scaffolding spine, an old radar dish pitted with burns. Beneath it all, heat bled from the deep stone, geothermal veins bent to human will, and held together with stubbornness and rust. Mark Egan had learned the sound of failing machines the way sailors learn the pitch of a sinking hull. 37 hours without sleep had sharpened it into a blade he could feel in his teeth. The condenser pumps were stuttering. The life support readouts ticked down a fraction, steadied. Then a dull thump vibrated the floor as a bypass relay kicked in. He wanted to smile at the tiny victory, but the smile wouldn't come. The outpost felt too large for one set of footsteps, too empty for the echoes that answered him. 41 days since the last human voice had faded into the carrier static. He tugged the thermal hood tighter around his neck and peered through the observation slit. Dust, lightning, the endless red plain beyond the pressure glass. His reflection looked back at him for a heartbeat, pale and blue-tinged. Gaunt face, a month of bad beard, eyes sunk like bruises. "You hold," he told the pumps, the conduits, the world. "You hold and I'll hold." The calm deck crackled so softly he thought at first it was only the storm chewing on the antenna. Then the pattern pulsed again and he froze, the wrench slipping from his hand and clanging off the floor. Not human, not a beacon ping, alive, rhythmic. He heard it in his bones. Velari. He shoved a diagnostic slate under his arm and jogged to the receiver array, fingers flying. The Velari language was part resonance, part tone, part electric ghost. He trained enough with their engineers to tell a ship-to-ship code from the way their vocal organs made the hull hum. This was not a hull. This was a throat strained past reason. SSSSD, the translator implant at his jawline buzzed, caught a thread, let it go. He leaned over the panel. Again, he whispered to nobody. "Come on again." The storm swallowed the world and then, like a bell struck in a distant cavern, the sound came back. 3 long pulses, 1 short, a pause. The pattern Velari scouts used when they'd lost all but breath and courage. He had his suit on before he realized he'd moved. The outer lock groaned. The air in the tunnel kissed his faceplate with frost. He clipped a fiber spool into the anchorage ring, white line ghosting into the wind like spider silk. His boots found the grooved path across the landing field, the little blue wolves of St. Elmo's fire chasing his steps. He told himself a dozen reasons he should turn back. He knew every one of them by heart, training, protocol, common sense. He kept going. Beyond the 3rd pylon, the plane broke into a shallow bowl of fused glass. The storm had formed it and filled it. Particles hissed over the lip like sand into an hourglass. The locator pulse's arrow shivered and then steadied, pointing down into smoke. He slid over the rim on his belly, boots finding grip against a promise of slope rather than the fact of it. The wind hammered and then softened as the bowl's curve took the worst away. Smoke swirled around him, terrifying more for what it hid than for what it revealed. The wreck wore a skin of frost and ash, half buried, the port wing a tooth melted to the gum of the ground. He knew Velari dropships, tall, spined, elegant things that looked like skulls of silver fish. This one had opened along its back like a mouth. The world inside was black with smoke and too still. He slid feet first into the wound. At first he saw wreckage, then a shape not wreckage at all. It belonged in some other story, some other scale, a living cliff, a fallen lightning strike. Silver-blue skin glowed faintly through the soot where armor had splintered. The smell of burned composite and something sharp as cold iron cut through the filters. She lay pinned under a collapsed support beam, breath a low furnace behind split lips. Rain, he thought stupidly, because the sheen on her skin looked like rain caught in silver glass. Then her eyes opened, and they were blue not like water but like the inside of a flame. The translator hummed. Human. A pause, a scraped mercy. Help. He stared like an idiot. Her pupils contracted with a predatory neatness. He remembered to breathe, and the world returned. Gauge lights shaking on the edge of red, the dull groan of metal losing a war downstairs, his own heart sending little hammers through his tongue. He yanked the pry jack from his harness and braced it under the beam. The beam was not his friend. It grudged him a centimeter and then stopped. He set his feet and pushed. He yelled into a bad sky. He thought about the people who had left because there had been no choice, and thought about the one who had not left because there had been no time, and put his back and arms and hate into it. The beam lifted a hand's breadth. Massive fingers, taloned, beautiful, slid free. The beam came down with a howl. He tasted copper. The suit told him his bicep had torn something it wished he would not tear again. He moved the jack closer to the fulcrum and pushed, not like a human against a machine, but like a man shoving a wall, because the wall was where the world ended, and he refused to live in that small a room. The beam gave. Her hand, big as his head, caught the edge, and now the two of them were a lever and a fulcrum, and a quiet vow pulled like wire through the storm. The beam lifted and twisted and fell, and she rolled to her knees with a sound like a foundry sighing. He staggered, panting. His helmet was a little planet where the air had learned to be thin. She turned toward him, the room tilting because the only thing in it that mattered had moved. Standing, she owned the space. She owned the gravity. She owned his sense of what a person could be. You are alone. The translator shaped her voice into a velvet thunder in his jaw. He wondered what it truly sounded like where his machine could not follow. Yeah, he said. He wanted to say more. What came out was the truth, small stone. For now, you should have gone. I didn't know how. Something in her face changed, not a smile, not yet, but that narrow place between anger and admiration where respect is born. What is your name, human who does not leave? Mark. I am Lyra, she said, and it was not a name so much as a chord played softly on a glass harp, a shape with edges that made him stand straighter. Of the ascendancy, of the house that remembers storms. Okay, he said, because he did not know how to carry the weight of titles or houses. Follow me if you can walk. I can do more than walk, she said without boasting, but her first step sprayed blood like paint across the black floor. She looked down at it in a way that made him think of wolves when they discover the teeth in their leg belong to a trap. The second step was cleaner. Outside the wreck, the storm said you are small, and he said back we are stubborn. She hunched against it, and he ran the fiber line across her arm guard, a pale leash that would keep them from losing one another. They passed the third pylon, then the second, tiny universes of St. Elmo's fire stringing blue pearls along the cable between them. Inside the lock, the outpost felt too bright, everything too close to his scale now that he had seen hers. She ducked under a door frame, and it was a miracle of muscles and math that she fit at all. He took her to the med bay, which looked like a toy hospital assembled by ants for a god. She sat on the floor because the tables were jokes. The floor tolerated her like a sea tolerates a mountain that has decided to be born under it. He found the Velari nutrient packs he'd never expected to use again. She took the pouch between two fingers the way a violinist takes up a bow. The smell in the room shifted to something mineral and cold. You know our food, she observed, not unkindly. Worked with your engineers, he said, waving a hand at his mess of adapter plates and handy abominations. Try to keep your vents singing when ours coughed. You sang well, she said quietly. She lifted her chin toward the bulkheads as if listening. I hear it still, your pulse in the stone. You kept it speaking your name when silence would have been easier. He looked away because something in his chest had gone bare and did not like being looked at. The storm kept gnawing the sky. That night, while he pretended not to watch, Lyra slept in the corner like a collapsed fortification and dreamed her armor back on. He stripped to the waist and lay under the exhaust conduits to listen to the whisper the condensers made when they were happy, and the hiss they made when they lied. Morning was a word Earth had taught him. Here it meant the storm dimmed from white to bruised violet, and the outpost lights discovered a second gear. He woke to a sound like a careful bell. Lyra had built a kettle out of his emergency still, and the sweetness of boiled water was so ridiculous both of them smiled. She moved in the rooms as if each had been built to test what the word giant meant. He learned the quiet tread of her feet and the sound the air made when she lowered herself from standing to sitting, a gentle rush like a sail sighing. The work did not ask their permission. Heat exchangers, oxygen scrubbers, the sorrowing creak of conduit that had been laid by people with time and was now tended by a man with none. He needed hands, she had hands. The first time their fingers touched by accident in the guts of a machine, he didn't jerk away. She didn't either. He told himself that was because they were busy. He showed her the way heat shivered through the pipes. She showed him the way metal sang when it wanted to fail and was only pretending to be strong. She could feel it with her fingertips. She could listen to it with her forearm pressed to a flange. He envied that until he realized he could, in a small way, learn it too if he loved the machines enough. When your people craft, she said one night, the lights humming like bees in the belly of the outpost, you do not only measure, you argue with the thing until it remembers a better shape. Begging, he said, grinning. We call that begging where I'm from. I have not heard begging done so beautifully, she said, and his grin died for reasons not entirely contained by pride. The third week, the supplementary heat failed, and the cold taught them both the exact shape of their breath. He tore a panel free with his belt knife and crawled into a crawlspace that hated the concept of his shoulders. Halfway in, his wrist torque spanner slipped. A spark fanned into a little starving flame. He blew too hard and the flame died and came back farther down the line. A shadow fell across the opening. He didn't look up. If you fit in here, he said through clenched teeth, I'm going to have to file a complaint about falsely labeled crawl spaces. Hold still, she rumbled. Her bare forearm slid in beside his. For a blink's absurd second, he saw their skins almost touching. His the color of river mud, hers like moonlight captured and taught to be muscle. Her finger and thumb pinched the very piece he had been cursing. She turned it 1/10 of a turn with the easy precision of a tool designed to fit a fastener. He realized his breath had slowed. The flame's blue edge steadied and narrowed and then went out like a long sentence finally finding its period. The heat ghosts came back to the room. He wriggled backward until his shoulders cleared the hatch. He turned too quickly and found himself nose to sternum. He tipped his head up, and her face was so close his helmet wouldn't have fit between them if he'd been wearing it. He could count the lines where her pupils tightened. He could count the faint traceries of darker blue that ran like veins beneath her skin. He could not count the number of times he had been this near another living thing in the last month because the number was 1. Thank you, he said. You will not thank me again, she said very gently. Why? Because your words keep me from remembering I am far from home. He understood that better than she wanted him to. Okay. He backed away. She lowered her eyes. The room learned again how to hold both their shapes without complaint. That was the day he turned the wrong corner at the wrong time and the wrong angels took notes. He had a rag in his hand and grease on the rag and somebody's, his blood under the grease. He was humming a song about oceans he had never seen when he stepped into the service corridor that led to the geothermal interface. The corridor doubled as a Velari berth because the humans had designed the station with hope and optimism and too little metal. The light in there favored the edges of things and made their middles shy. He took one more step. The hummed song died. Lyra stood in the middle of the room unarmored. The reactive undersuit she usually wore draped from one shoulder like spat tide. Her back was a cartographer's dream, geography made from strength and grace. The line from neck to shoulder to the long hinge of her elbow was a truth he had wanted to know and now did too much. The plane of her back was not a plane at all but a landscape, ridges of muscle, valleys for the light, 1,000 nameless rivers converging at the small of her back where the undersuit caught like night on a coastline. Her hair lay in thick silver coils, braided for war, unbound for no one, until that moment. She turned. His body forgot it was his. He was all eyes and his eyes were treason. Her face in that half-light was every contradiction he'd ever learned to love. Predator and penitent, storm and shelter. The line of her collarbone spoke the word vulnerable in a language he could not name. The fine scars laddering her ribs turned the word into a prayer. Her eyes found his. The room could have flayed itself and he would not have looked away. The sound she made was not a word and the translator did not dare try to make it one. It was surprise cut with anger, a small wound on a deep instrument. She moved, and what should have registered as mass and threat registered instead as contained fury. The undersuit slid down her arm to the bend of her elbow. The air grew a temperature that had nothing to do with the heat exchangers. "You should not be here," she said finally, softly enough that the room leaned in. The translator followed like a respectful shadow. "Among my kind, this is a room with a door." He had nothing. "I'm sorry," he managed, and in the words he meant. "Forgive me, strike me, teach me, do not break the one good thing that has happened here." Her hand, larger than his chest, twitched toward a weapon that was not there, then stopped. She stood with every muscle under her skin, remembering what discipline was, struggling to shape a new definition. "You saw what no human was meant to see." He flinched as if the truth had weight. "And now," she said, voice lower, tighter, old law riding new pain, "you are bound." He could have asked, "What does that mean?" He did not because he saw the answer written at the corner of her mouth, in the strict set line, in the grief behind the anger. "It means," she said anyway, and this time the translator took a second to line up its courage, "that some part of me will never be indifferent to whether you live." The outpost chose that moment to remind them that the world beyond a single room still existed. The lights flickered once like a heartbeat that forgot the next beat and then remembered. Twice. A wrenched squeal came from the floor. The emergency klaxons found their voice and were not shy. He ran. She ran behind him and it sounded like a weather system learning to be legs. The control room gave them bad news in moments. The geothermal output was falling out of the green and into the sharp lip of panic where nothing graceful ever happens. "Ice in the regulator," he said, not because he had proof yet, but because he and the station had an old understanding about the lies it told. "Manual reset." "Outside," she said. "Outside," he confirmed. "You will die between here and there," she said, not a threat but an inventory. "I'll die here anyway if I don't." He pulled a suit over fear the way a diver pulls water over his head because he believes in air on the other side. She caught his arm, his bones noticed. "Then I come with you." The storm had saved some fury for this, perhaps in case two small bright things made of bone and stubbornness decided to cross its mouth with a coil of fiber between them. They leaned at angles that made no mathematical or moral sense. Sometimes the ground existed where their feet fell. Sometimes it tried to pretend it did not. Static sprinted along the tether, blue lightning trapped in a string that was also a promise. They reached the regulator stack by daring it not to leave, by demanding it stay part of their story. Ice had grown around it like a crown somebody mean had put on something that had never wanted one. He dug and she tore. And if you want to know the difference between those two verbs, imagine a man fighting a door and a giantess persuading a wall to grow a hinge. The ice screamed. The regulator woke. The outpost's bones sighed. Then the ground took a breath and cracked. The crack ran under Mark the way a hunting dog runs under birds. The lip went out from under him and gravity remembered his name. The tether held. Lyra caught. She caught the man and the crack and the breath the story had taken. It took 3 of her fingers into the blue light and gave them back blistered and furious. It took a year off her voice and left the rest intact. "Hold," she said, not to him, to the world. He held anyway. She hauled him up like a fisherman with a friend on his hook. They sprawled together on the ice, and for a heart's quiet they did not move, because moving would mean this had really happened and might happen again. When they could feel their names in their mouths once more, he pushed up to his elbows. She was looking at his face with an expression that would not be a joke no matter who told it. "Why?" she said. "For heat." He said first because humor was a habit and mercy. Then, because he was tired and the global storm had sanded away the safer skins a man wears. "Because you are here." They stood. The storm allowed itself to be edged back from murder toward meanness, and they walked in a bubble of exhausted laughter and terrible quiet back to the outpost. The heat found them there and sat on their shoulders. He stripped his suit and his hands shook. And when the hands shook too much to hold a mug, hers steadied them, and the mug kissed his lips and took a long while pouring half a cup down a dry throat. They leaned against the same bulkhead like old soldiers who had never seen war and wished to stay that way. She did not thank him for surviving. He did not thank her for refusing his death. The room learned there was a third thing between gratitude and debt. It asked for neither's coin. The days turned into work because work is how the living stay on the right side of the glass. She told him about the Velari in small, broken songs wrapped inside other subjects. Their cities were built into the bones of mountains and lit by tides that learned to glow. Their dead were not buried. They were sung into the crystals under the coastal shelves where the sea could hold them, and the living could hear their advice when storms made the world walk on its hands. The plague had come like bad grammar into a language. It unstitched. It frayed the truth of bodies. Their births dwindled, and the births that remained were riddled with cruel errors. They built ships and empires and went to war with the dark only to discover the enemy had built a house in their blood. "We hid," she said, not in shame but the tone species use when telling their children why the world now looks this way. "We called it selection. We called it honor. It was another shape of famine." "And you came here," he said, "because asking hurt her more than being told." She nodded. "To study your stubborn selves, to put our hands back on the wheel before the road turned into sea. Did you find what you came for?" She looked at him for a long time, and something in the look put a hand on his shoulder and made him want to sit down. "Yes and no, we found you." She touched the bulkhead with the back of her knuckles. "We found this. We found a way to ask a different question." He would have asked what that meant if the sky had not cracked open with a light that was not lightning. The Velari warship hung above the storm like a judgment somebody had carved out of the idea of a moon and then taught to undock. It blotted a slice of sky and poured a sound the ground had been built to hate into the wind. Dropships peeled off like scales. Lyra stood very still. Her face made silence, then logic made it speak. "They are not rescue." "How sure?" he asked, although the piece of him that talked to machines and mine shafts and broken ribs had already aligned his tools and picked its war. High Command forbade human contact on frontier worlds after failures. She swallowed a word. He recognized the shape of it. Scandal, sickness, the kind of story that grows teeth long after the bodies are gone. They will sterilize the surface and call it protocol. He looked at her the way you look at a cliff you intend to climb because everything you love is over it. Then we make protocol regret its translation. They turned the outpost into a fist. He pulled the reactor's dream of order apart and rewove it into a snare. He took the dish that had asked the sky for friendship and taught it to sing ache into electronics. Lyra knelt among the defense drones with a soldering knife in her fingers and taught them to know her people as enemies for 1 hour only. The part of her that had been born into a house that remembers storms did not weep while she did this. Something else did later, alone, into a rag that smelled like his hands. "Once the pulse goes," he said, pointing at a snarled diagram, "we'll have a minute, maybe 2, while their dropships forget how to be bodies instead of ideas. I can make 2 minutes an hour," she said without boasting, and made him believe her. When the first dropships came into range, he hit the dish with his palm the way you hit the back of a misbehaving radio, and a wall of sound the machines could hear but men could not pounded the air flat. The lead ship coughed its memory out through its landing gear and tipped like a drunk. The second sat down wrong and remembered its legs a second too late, tearing one off at the knee. Lyra went out the lock like a hurricane that had learned to walk. The drones whirled around her like hawks taught to hunt at midnight. She hit the first Velari soldier the way oceans hit cliffs in bad dreams. It was not grace. It was not cruelty. It was a math that could not be solved with anything on the other man's belt. She broke armor at its cunning, not its seams. She moved through the honest physics of mass with a peculiar elegance that made rage look like a science. Mark took the high corridor and made electricity his religion. He turned doors into lotteries and hallways into bad bets. He knew where the floor clamps had been left sloppy, because he'd left them sloppy on purpose weeks ago, when he'd thought about raiders the way you think about rain. A soldier who had never been tired in his life hit one of those clamps with his heel and got to know gravity faster than he'd planned. Mark whispered a thank you to every bolt he'd left at a wrong angle. The warship up there sneered its shadow across the dome. It sent a lance of something that was only technically light toward the reactor, and the reactor took it and said no, thank you, and spat cooked air back through the discharge vent with such force the dropship above it flipped like a beetle on a hot plate. Mark laughed and then remembered that laughing at war is how men stay sane for 6 seconds longer than their bodies can afford. Lyra was a song and a wound. She fought where he pointed. He adapted where she bled. They built a language of breath and curses and hand signs that neither species had needed before, and both species would use in legends later. And then reality did what reality always does when courage paints lines across it. It pushed back. The third wave landed on the far side of the outpost where the dish's shadow failed, and the vent's geometry didn't matter. They came through the auxiliary lock after a shaped charge taught the lock a new philosophy. It took Mark 9 seconds to realize the charge had also done something ugly to the reactor's control grid. He could feel the grid stutter through his boots. "Talk to me," Lyra said in his ear, not because she needed words, but because the human voice had turned into a rope between cliffs. "Core's drifting," he said. "I can bring it back if I vent manual, but if they hit the body while I'm in there, then you will be inside a star while it remembers how to be small. Yeah." He drew a breath he could not afford to own and looked at the switch that would open the control trench. "Cover me." "I am already your roof," she said, and went to war with more care than rage. He slid into the control trench. It was the kind of space that had been designed by a man who wanted to fit a hand where a city wanted to go. He wedged himself into an argument between 2 heat exchangers and spoke to the core with the voice you use when coaxing a feral, injured animal out from under a porch. "Hey, friend, we're not done yet." It sang back to him in a language his ears could not hear and his bones could. He found the stuck vent gate with a crowbar and a swear and jammed it open. Then jammed it open some more because machines lie when pain becomes their philosophy. The temperature gauge on his left knee told him that all the numbers had agreed briefly on one word: regret. A boot scraped concrete above him. He froze. He had been a soldier once. That part of him gagged on the memory. He could tell a Velari boot by the way it asked the ground to inform on you. He had enough breath to form one word and used it foolishly. Lyra. The trench filled with shadow, then with a body that moved faster than a myth. She dropped into the trench like an avalanche that had been taught surgical precision. The Velari soldier who followed her got his nerves rearranged by her elbow and his armor given back to him in 4 smaller pieces. In the space her landing left in the air, Mark pushed the last fraction of leeway into the gate, and the core made the sound a tight muscle makes when you finally rub it the right way and it lets go. The heat exhaled through the safe vents instead of the unwise ones. The reactor's song found its old key. "Out," she said, already bleeding from a gash along her ribs that would have downed somebody less persuaded by the idea of endurance. He wriggled backward, a shot blew concrete dust into his mouth, and he tasted rock and fear and the bitter exultation of not dying yet. He turned and fired a salvage bolt driver into a helmet that had not been built to fear bolts. Helmets learn what fear is if they live long enough. They fought backward into the dome, step, breathe, lie, step, laugh, curse, step. There is a way of moving that is not retreat and not advance but simply refusal. They moved that way until the warship above them decided irritation deserved escalation. The beam that came down was not a beam. It was the absence of anything you can live in. It touched the far dome and the far dome ceased believing in architecture. It kissed the edge of the main dome and the main dome remembered an old lover named Vacuum and decided to invite them in. "Seals," Mark said. His voice did not have room for tenderness. "On," Lyra grunted, and the emergency baffles put themselves between atmosphere and hunger. The world went dim. The air went thin with the quickness of a knife. The warning lights learned the shape of panic and wore it badly. She looked at him. The wound at her side welled once and then stopped, the Velaric equivalent of a tourniquet pulling itself into place beneath the skin. Her eyes were bright with too many kinds of light. "Go," he started. "No," she said, because the oldest argument had chosen new voices. "If I leave you, I will leave more than you." "You said I was bound," he said. "I did," she answered, and in the way her throat worked he heard I did not know how much. Another blast. The control room kissed the floor. The outpost made a small, sad sound the way houses do when a storm puts a hand against their chest and leans. The warship drifted lower, lazy as a bad god. Mark looked at the dish that had sung so well for them and saw it ask a question he had not wanted to face. "How many times do you think we can do this?" He looked at the reactor and saw the truth the way gamblers know when the table has learned their tricks. He looked at Lyra and saw the only arithmetic that still made sense. "Time to be irresponsible," he said, and ran for the manual overdrive. "Mark," he slapped the override with a palm and the reactor stopped negotiating and became what it had always wanted to be. The hum in the floor crescendoed from polite to rude to religious. He sprinted for the dish, because if you are going to build a billion-volt lie, you had better tell it with a big mouth. "On my mark," he said, panting, and he hated that his name was involved. "Say it twice so the sky hears," she said, standing between him and every club heaven owned. "Mark," he said, and threw the switch. The dish caught lightning it had not earned and threw it like a drunk throws his last bottle, beautifully, with aim born from despair's freedom. The warship's shields wavered. The next volley chewed its own tongue trying to form. For 3 breaths the gun that had unmade part of their home forgot it was a gun and asked if it might be a lake instead. Lyra went through the lock like an oath and cut down the squad that had been counting hard to the number of steps that separated murder from an interesting afterlife. Mark redirected a grid, then another, then watched the feed collapse because the dish had learned the difference between telling the sky a story and pulling the sky down by its hair. The beam came anyway. It burned through the dish and into the ground. It burned through the auxiliary dome and taught it humility. It found the top of the reactor casing and tried to name it a memory. The casing argued louder. The argument was loud enough to kill a mountain. Mark turned, dragging breath after breath into a chest that had, for the last 14 minutes, been negotiating a new relationship with ribs and pressure. Lyra was there, a wall of blood and light and intention, and behind her the lock coughed out 2 drones that had not died yet and thought worshipfully of doing it for her. The reactor's core stuttered. He could feel it in his teeth. He could taste its stutter in the iron of his mouth. The manual vents would hold if someone held them. "Go," she said, reading the terrible math on his face. "If I go down there," he said, "I can keep it from learning the wrong lessons. But I have ruined too many wars to not finish this one," she said, and he realized she had mistaken his but for a goodbye and was answering something else. "I will keep their hands off your spine." He opened his mouth to argue and watched the shape of her wrist and realized there are times you can use words as sandbags and times you must throw your body. "I hate this plan," he said. "We will bury it in a good place," she promised, and was gone like a vow. He slid into the heat with his hands forward. He turned wheels no one had designed to be turned fast. He sang to a metal heart he had been trained to admire but not to love. He smelled old burning and new luck. Above him the station bled. The storm sneered. Somewhere 2 species made a bet. The core resisted dying with such enthusiasm that for a flash he loved it more than his own life. He coaxed and lied and bribed and strong-armed, and in the end the long-stuck valve learned to like the idea of being open. The temperature came down with a sulk. He scrambled up the trench, lungs insisting on choices he was disinclined to honor. He came to the lock and found it open to the night. Beyond it, where the landing field had been, was a shape like a fallen piece of the sky, and around it bodies and bodies, and a path cut between them where one stubborn thing had refused the math of the many. He saw her out there in the sea of dying light, a tower whose base had learned to walk. She was moving like a cathedral going to war. He stumbled toward her because the opposite direction did not exist. The warship above them flickered. Someone in its belly remembered fear. It drew up like a hand withdrawing from something it did not wish to break but could not own. The dropships hesitated. Lyra turned her head and spoke one word into her throat that the translator refused. He did not need it. "Come." He reached her. She was in a kneel he did not understand. Then he did. Her knee was in the chest of a man who had been built to survive gorges and gossip. Her hand was on the throat vines that Velari call hearts. Her eyes were on his because in the moment it mattered he was the measurable thing in the room. "Do you live?" she asked, and the sound of it was a physical hand on his sternum. "Yes," he said. "Then do you?" "Yes," she said, which meant for now. He leaned his shoulder under her arm not because she needed it but because he did. Together they walked 10 steps that explained to the ground who owned it. Behind them the warship turned with the reluctance of a bully who has finally learned the geometry of enough. It lifted, it sulked, it went. Silence is not quiet after war. It is a tinnitus of ghosts. The wind found the field and brushed the dead. Mark wanted to sit and let his body remember its old occupation. He wanted to sleep the way machines sleep when you unplug them and they sigh with guilty relief. He kept standing because Lyra was standing because endurance is an infection as greedy as despair when it finds a good host. They spent the next hour turning off the screams of metal. They spent the next day stuffing the sky with messages that used to be pleas and now were calls to a feast. They ate rations that had learned to taste like their fingerprints and slept in turns. He woke to the quiet. The storm had taken a day to decide it had not been invited. The sky outside had been scrubbed to a blue almost the color of her eyes. The wind had a new shape. The silence had a word in it he did not know and thought might be tomorrow. He found her in the auxiliary lock, one knee drawn up, elbows resting there like a woman who had just remembered she had bones in her shoulders and was consulting them on a matter of standing. "We lived," he said. "For an elastic definition of the word," she answered, dry enough to make him grin. "What happens now?" he asked. He meant, between us, to the two civilizations that had decided to keep their mistakes in separate cabinets until the cabinets fell over. She turned her head and the motion was careful. "I will bury my dead." She said it as a ritual and as a woman and as a soldier who had finally learned there is no difference in the parts that matter. "Then I will take a message to my high command they cannot kill without killing half of me." "What message?" "That our weakness is our pride." She looked at his hands as if the message lived in the grease there. That the cure that saves a people comes sometimes in a shape they were taught to despise. That if we cannot bend we will break, and the breaking will not be beautiful. He nodded. He had no power to make a species listen. He had power to build a transmitter that could talk to a ship that could talk to a fleet. He began to do that. They worked, and the outpost forgot it had been hurt by remembering how much it loved purpose. It learned a new hum. It learned a new patience. The Velari returned, not as purifiers but as mourners. A ship smaller than the first and older in its voice drifted down. Lyra stood on the landing field with her back to Mark and her face to her history. The ramp touched dust. 4 figures the size of halls came down it, armor polished, faces bare of anything they did not wish to bring to her. They stopped 10 paces off and did not speak for a breath that would have been impolite to interrupt with anything but the right words. Then the eldest, a man whose shoulders had been taught weight at birth, tilted his head. "Commander Lyra, House of Storm Memory," he said, and the translator let even a human hear the ache. "We thought you Ash." She touched her sternum with 2 fingers and lowered them to her thigh. An old gesture Mark had learned to read as "Here I am and my ghosts and my failures and my honor. Weigh them together." "I am blood and breath still," she said. "Your orders were to sterilize this world. I made them untrue." The man's jaw worked. Behind him, a woman who had not spoken yet closed her eyes as if tasting the word untrue in her mouth, measuring it. "We were told," the man said carefully, "that human contact had consequences." "Everything has consequences," Lyra said, and in her voice something old in the elders straightened. "I bring one you did not predict. The human genome exhibits resistance patterns our children have begged for in their sleep. This world gave me a human who is the shape of endurance. His hands kept the heat in the bones. His defiance kept the sky off our faces. He saw me," her jaw tightened. She did not look at Mark, "and I bound myself to his survival. If that is consequence, weigh it against extinction." Silence stood up taller than any of them. Then the woman opened her eyes. They were not Lyra's blue but a duskier purple that had watched too many years. "Bring your data to my ship," she said. "Bring your human if he will come." "I will," Mark said from where he had been pretending to be utility tubing. They all turned. He swallowed a dozen things he should not say and did not. "If there's a cure for your kids in what we are, you can have what I know. If there's a cure for my kids in knowing you, we'll take that too." The elder's mouth twitched, a movement so small it might have been exhaustion. "You speak like a person who thinks tomorrow is real." "I maintain equipment for a living," Mark said. "Tomorrow is what happens to men who choose the right bolts." They went up the ramp. The ship inside did not feel like the warship had felt. It felt like a church learned engineering and told the truth about both. Crystals along the walls hummed with the talk of old waves. The air tasted faintly of salt and something sweet that was not sugar. It reminded Mark, absurdly, of summer stone warming under rain. The lab was smaller than he expected and filled with tools whose shapes made his hands itch to touch them. Lyra set a small crystalline unit in a cradle and it sang. The cradle listened and turned the song into numbers. The elders watched, faces doing very little but eyes doing a lot. "You see," Lyra said, pointing a knot of data that looked like a star tied into itself and then taught to pretend not to be. Here, human adaptation signatures where ours fray, we can borrow this. We can unfray our future. The elder woman leaned close, an impossible grace in the way a giant moves when she interprets the tiny. You are certain. I have never been certain of anything, Lyra said, not humbly, but I would be a coward to pretend I do not believe. And you, human, the man said, turning his chin toward Mark without lowering it. What do you believe? That fear is good at costumes, Mark said, and pride is excellent at disguising itself as caution, and that if you leave here and tell your commanders you met nobody and found nothing, in 100 years nobody will remember your names and nothing will be all you leave. If you risk this, if you graft our stubborn onto your grace, your children will be obnoxious and noisy and break things and disobey curfew. I would like to risk a galaxy with them in it. Silence again, a good silence, the kind you want to hand around the room like bread. Then we will break the rule, the elder woman said softly. It would not be the worst rule we have broken. Send me back, Lyra said, surprising herself with the speed of the words. I will not ask my soldiers to carry this to men who will take it from their mouths. I will carry it. I will carve the law again. The elder met her eyes in that measuring way women use when they are considering their daughters and their dead and the shape patience must take. You are wounded. I am also obedient when the order deserves me, Lyra said. This one does not. If you prefer a more careful messenger, the elder raised a hand. Irreverent child, she said affectionately, and Mark saw inside the whole edifice of the ascendancy a kitchen and a long table and a family and the way houses begin and end. Go then, take the human if he will. If you fail, fail in a way that shames men who would refuse your proof. I'll go, Mark said before his good sense could pull at his sleeve. But I'll come back. The outpost still needs coils, and this planet will crash the systems if nobody asks after its moods. Human, the elder said, you may be the first of your kind to be invited to our Senate Hall. He shrugged, embarrassed. I'll put on a clean shirt. They left the outpost in the care of 2 drones with more personality than most sergeants and the dogged patience of small things. The ship rose through a crack in the storm and showed them the red plane turned into a shallow sea of glass under a sky that had finally remembered it was allowed to be blue. In orbit, the stars flexed around the warship like a muscle. Command relayed, then relented. The first time a room built to hold policy heard Mark's voice, it flinched. He was too clear and too tired to be anything but dangerous. Lyra spoke the way mountain roads speak when you ask them if it was worth building them. She told them about the plague and her dead, and how she had decided to keep one human alive because law had never been meant to kill faith. She told them about the outpost and the regulator and a dish that sang a weapon into being, and the way a man looks at you after he has seen you without the armor and chooses to stay. Is he your mate? Someone asked. Crass with the insulation power gives against truth. Lyra's eyes moved to Mark's face and then to the room as if the concept of mate were an object with corners and she was measuring which would bruise first. He is my consequence, she said, which was more honest. The room turned. It did not turn quickly because rooms like that do not, but it turned. Science allies stepped forward with a ferocity that had been sharpened in private. Generals stepped backward in a form of advance that only generals can justify. Policy learned new words. A vote happened. Another. Lyra did not watch the count. She watched a single old man's hands. When his fingers stopped tapping and folded, she let out a breath that had been living in her for 30 years. They made a corridor where none had been and walked through it. The first clinical trials for a gene splice, whose metaphor already had 1,000 poems, began in a quiet room lit for kindness instead of clarity. Children born 2 years later on a moon where the rocks glow with stored day would have 2 sets of grandparents, and none of them would be smug about it. Mark went home and fixed the pump that had decided it preferred being a museum piece to a member of an ecosystem. He laid wire. He taught drones to cheat well. He built a little makeshift chapel in a maintenance closet and did not pray in it because he did not know to whom to pray. But sometimes he sat there when the storm wanted to borrow his optimism, and he needed a chair that remembered his weight. Lyra returned in a ship that smelled like the same summer stone and like new bread. She walked through the lock without permission and stood with him in a room that had seen too much of both their blood. He handed her a mug. She took it. He looked at her side and saw a ridge of scars that had learned to be beautiful. "We made them listen," she said. "You did," he answered. "I just made it harder for them to ignore the wrong thing." She set the mug down because her hands had learned to shake when they weren't doing anything important. "You saw me," she said suddenly. The words were as quiet as the day she'd said them first and more dangerous. "And I chose to let you live in the part of me that does not forgive easily. Do you understand how stupid that is?" "Yeah," he said and did not look away. "I troubled your gravity, you troubled mine. What do we do with that?" she asked, and if she had been a different kind of person it would have been flirtation or cruelty. It was neither, it was architecture. "We build around it," he said. "We invite our friends to live there, we hang pictures." She laughed, surprised and offended by tenderness and grateful for it. They walked the outpost like priests after a storm and blessed everything that had not died. They repaired the things that had, and said the names of the ones they could not fix until the names learned to be less sharp. Word went out into the starwind. The Velari stopped sterilizing worlds where humans clung like burrs. Humans started listening when Velari told them a machine was pretending to be braver than it was. Trade routes became lines on a map that did not mean food so much as forgiveness. The Ascendancy Senate lifted a sanction that had felt like an amputation. Earth's council sent a gifted mechanic to consult on how to teach arrogance to like smaller rooms. It was not swift. It was not clean. Some generals died loudly and badly, refusing to be dragged into a future that had no use for their catalog of old victories. Some children were born in ships that could not afford a distance between laughter and mistakes, and those children grew into people who wore stubbornness the way trees wear wind. One noon that wore the shape of dusk because storms are sentimental about their old habits. A private channel on Mark's console lit with a tone only he and one other person knew. He tapped it and her face filled his world. The screen wanted to be too small. His heart wanted to be the right size. "I am far from you," she said simply. "I hate that," he said, with the ease of men who have decided honesty is cheaper than pride. "I am in a hall where the law was written on old bone," she said. "I will write across it. When I am done, they will call it disrespect. When their children grow up, they will call it history. I do not wish to do this alone." "You're not," he said, and adjusted a feed so his voice would run like water down the long glass door behind her. In the old hall, women of houses with names like storms turned their heads at the sound. "You never will be again." After the call, the outpost sighed through its pipes. He sat in the little chapel and did not pray. He took out the rag she had bled into here and there, and folded it the way sailors fold flags, and did not know if that made him superstitious or careful or in love with a version of dignity that made sense with a wrench in his hand. The seasons found the planet. The storm left for days at a time. A tiny green smear appeared in the lee of a boulder near the southern pylon, the first life mutinous enough to attempt a home there. He fenced it with scrap and laughed at himself for putting a fence around a hope. Lyra came when she could, which was not enough, and then suddenly for longer than he expected. They learned the exact weight their hands could carry of the other before fatigue called in debts. They did not marry because the word in either language did not stretch well over their shapes, but they practiced the part of marriage that matters most, making the small room of a shared life bigger without lying to any of the walls. Sometimes the warship that had wanted them dead drifted through his sleep. He woke to a ground that was not shaking, and thanked the ground as if it were responsible. Sometimes she woke with her eyes open, and he put his palm against the back of her neck and whispered names of tools until she could breathe again. He did not know what it meant. It worked. Years later, yes, years, Valaric children with human mischief and human kids with Valaric patience built forts in the maintenance tunnels and told each other ghost stories about the Core's song. Mark retired into the job he'd always loved and pretended he was not retiring. Lyra took a command she had not asked for and then used it to disassemble a policy that had once nearly killed her. They fought rarely, and then it was about foolish things like whether a bolt should be a quarter turn tighter because the tremor sings sweeter at that pitch, or because the tremor grew from pride, not need. On a day so clear the blue felt like something you could step into. A human rescue ship finally came into the orbit it had promised long ago. It found a functioning outpost and a fence around a stubborn plant, and 2 species roasting a terrible excuse for meat over a heat vent, while arguing about the toe pattern of a native scavenger. The crew came down with polite faces and left with history under their nails. The universe did not become kind. It became possible. When he was old and his hands needed longer to remember what perfect pressure felt like on a wrench, Mark taught apprentices how to listen for lies in machines. He taught them the difference between a miracle and a well-timed maintenance cycle. When they asked about the scorch mark on the far pylon and the fused glass near the landing field, he said, "That's where we chose to be wrong and were right." When Lyra's hair went more silver than night, she stopped braiding it the way soldiers do and let it fall the way rivers do near certain cliffs. She attended councils in person less often and sent younger officers who had never learned to hate the soft right things. She visited the outpost and stood, hat in hand, for a long time at the little fence around the plant, which had become not little at all. She asked it questions about endurance. It did not answer in words. On his last morning, he woke before the light remembered its job, made tea badly, and walked the perimeter with a limp that had learned comedy. The air smelled like something clean after old work. He stopped by the glass bowl where he had once fallen and looked down. The scar was still there. He laughed, which sounded like a machine with new grease. He found her in the maintenance chapel, sitting cross-legged, forehead against the bulkhead the way she did when she wanted to hear the dead. He sat beside her. Their shoulders touched in the exact place 2 measurements agree. "I got old," he said. "You got true," she said, and it felt like the same thing. "If tomorrow doesn't include me," he said softly, "make sure it still has good bolts." "I will," she promised, and the room believed her. He closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because for once he could afford to. She told him a story about a storm somewhere else that had learned to chase its own tail until it forgot to chew ships. He smiled. He forgot, in the best possible way, the difference between silence and sound. She sat there longer than sense allowed. When she finally rose, she walked to the fence and took it down. The plant did not need it. Neither did the world. On the day they told his story to children with both kinds of eyes, they did not mention the moment in a corridor when a woman took off a suit and a man accidentally saw her. They told instead what that moment taught 2 people to teach 2 species. They said a human once apologized correctly. They said a giantess once broke a law that deserved breaking. They said machines will tell you when they want to die, and if you love them enough, you can delay their surrender. They said you can be bound to someone and not own them. They said endurance is an art and a science and a faith. When the storm rose again years after he left, it found a station that smiled back with more lights than before, and a child on the landing field holding a sensor pole like a flag. The child's mother was a Velari officer with scars that had been songs. The child's father was an engineer who had learned to sleep through alarms until someone he trusted touched his shoulder. The storm asked the old question, "You are small." The station answered the new answer, "We are many." And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken. See.